Hello, students of 423 and 523. This will be the last recording that I do while still traveling in New England in my tiny little room in a cabin in Maine. I probably won't get a chance to send a video tomorrow. So instead of focusing on trying to focus on both Twain and Hart in a very, very long uh, video, I'm going to focus on a concept that I think is important to both of them and is actually related to some of the questions I'm asking you to focus on. First of all, a little bit of review. Twain certainly has elements in it where you can focus on existential panic, and you can also focus on the issues of radical freedom. We already covered those in a couple of handouts that I had before and a couple of short videos that I made earlier on. You definitely have a moment where the fog descends on the river and Huck is lost and has to find his way out of that. That's definitely a moment of radical freedom where any direction he goes seems to be the wrong one and he doesn't know where it is. And that's certainly at play here. But what I want to focus on today is this idea of liminal space, which is also covered in the handout. In this reading, you have to go to supplemental readings and get a hold of the handout to do the reading. Liminal space is a concept that if you've taken my classes before, you've probably run into before because I'm kind of fascinated by it. Liminal spaces are these spaces both within culture and within language and literature where transformation occurs and the rules don't generally apply. Like I said, it's an anthropological term, and it mostly focuses quite literally on space. So what you'd be looking at are usually ritualistic or threshold spaces, spaces we go into or pass through, in which the rules don't necessarily apply, in which we are sort of thrown into a moment of confusion or magic that allows us to become something different. And there are a lot of reasons why both cultures and religions and even social groups have these very powerful ritualistic acts that are connected to important ritualistic spaces that you have to pass through. A marriage ritual of carrying someone across the threshold is quite literally that is a potent and sort of problematic as well moment of transformation. Transubstantiation in the Catholic and the Episcopalian liturgy, where people are literally taking the wine and it becomes blood, and the cracker and it becomes the body. The bread becomes the body. It's a cracker where I go to church. Is a moment of transformation, is quite literally liminal. So how is this important to Twain? And I'm going to focus on Twain today because it's fresh in my mind. Well, Twain's a cultural satirist, and a potent one. He uses withering sarcasm and often cynicism to and certainly irony and satire to attack not only the institution of slavery at occasion and the racial segregation in America, but also issues of class and power. Anyone who is entitled, anyone who thinks they're better than someone else simply because of how they were born or where they were born or what they were born with, is going to find themselves at the sharp end of Mark Twain's stick. And this is why we love him. And he can be uproariously funny at times. There are a couple moments in the reading here, but I focused a little bit more with these readings and choosing them on sort of the powerful emotional transformations that go on in these characters. So Twain uses the river as a device for transformational change. Now, oftentimes in literature, when we see liminal space, it's in a fantasy novel, like in the Chronicles of Narnia, when you have to go through a closet, when the Pevenses go through the closet in order to get to Narnia. Well, both Narnia and the closet itself are liminal spaces, and they're transformational. And the whole point of this journey that these children go on is to grow and change. It's really a story about it's a Bildungsroman. It's a story about growing up and what we gain and what we lose in that process of growing up. And the Pevenses, who are at the time going through a terrible war and a lot of hardship and loss, need to go to this place to become fully integrated adults. C.S. Lewis also uses the Chronicles of Narnia to make social commentary and social satire. Well, Twain's doing much the same thing, only he's a naturalist. He's not into fantasy. He's interested in this world. So the river is a river, is a river, is a river. It's not representative of anything but a river. And but that doesn't mean that there isn't magic in it. In fact, the river is very magical in the way that it becomes a liminal space that people can be transformed on. And it's not just Twain that thinks of the Mississippi River as a liminal space, or indeed riverboats. Riverboats were incredibly magical at that time. Um, there are moments in reading Twain where you get the sense of it's almost like Star Wars, like the river is a rocket ship. Uh, there were no highways, there were no airplanes. How would you get from one end of the country to another? You'd have to take a riverboat. And you travel the Mississippi, which is neither north nor south nor east nor west, because it goes straight down the center of the country, and its tributaries branch out in both directions. Also, the riverboat itself is a transformational space where all sorts of crazy things can happen. So there's the river, which is transformational, and the riverboat, which is also transformational. Um, and all of these rules of society get really disrupted there. In fact, the riverboat was like a site for this well into the 20th century when jazz bands started to play on the riverboat, and the riverboats became deeply integrated, even in the South, where you have bands playing music. And why is it that music always knocks people out of their complacent and sort of comfortable positions? You get people up and dancing and singing, and they start dancing and singing together. It's just what happens. Maybe that's why all the whorehouses had music in New Orleans. And that's where all the jazz musicians came up. But the riverboats were like that. And so Twain uses the riverboat and the river and the raft upon it to signal a transformational space and to put his characters in positions where they must change, where they have to change, and in which they're challenged. So, in life in the Mississippi, the very wealthy people on the riverboat find out very quickly that they have no power. That the person who has ultimate power over their lives and deaths is the captain, who realizes that the river ultimately has power over his life and death. And even when he thinks he's got that figured out, he'll come up upon a raft, someone with a stick pushing a raft across the river, who has in some ways equal power with him, because it's like a raft can take down a riverboat and can sink one totally accidentally. But there become these competing worlds. For Huck, this is incredibly important because the longer he's on that river, the closer he gets to Jim. And so what we're really seeing while Huck's on this river is the transformation of one character from one place to another. And Huck's basically a good person who has been influenced by all of this crap, cultural crap that's around him, just the way it influences us. 90% of the horrible things we think and feel have been fed to us through all sorts of different ways: television, media, music, our own parents and our friends. The places we live kind of define us. So to get on that river was to get away from those things, to force Huck to deal with Jim as a man, not just as an N-word. In some ways, it's really ironic that Huckleberry Finn is one of the books that we often see banned because of its use of racial stereotypes and for the use of that N-word. Because in almost every way, Huckleberry Finn is years and years and years ahead of its time. And its representation of Huck and Jim and the growth of their relationship is incredibly revolutionary. We see that section where Huck gets lost in the fog, and he's terrified. And he's terrified because he can't find Jim. He's terrified because he's separated from Jim. And then when it's all over, he tries to reassert his power by playing a cruel joke on Jim. and which only leads to his shame. So what you're really seeing here is this powerful social satire, and what Twain is doing is using that river, using that space to break down these sort of adapted and adopted attitudes that his characters have about the world, about class and race and even gender. Um, Although I would not call Twain a feminist. There is a whole lot of cross-dressing going on, just like in Shakespeare, and that in sort of inherently challenges some stereotypes about what it means to be a man or a woman in the novel. Um, Twain is one of the most important social satirists of the 19th century, and he gave withering critique to some really terrible social conventions of the period. Now, Bret Harte, his satire is much more directed at class, but there are also these important liminal transformational spaces. So when you look at these works, look at who's being transformed, how, and where, and how these spaces help to transform them. Because even in a naturalistic or a realistic work, there's still magic to be had. There always is in any good literature. And that magic is in how, through story, through experience, we become who we are. And for all of his withering cynicism, and Mark Twain wrote some powerfully cynical books. Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court has one of the most cynical endings in literature. But these works are not. These works are ultimately about the ability of a human being to change. And Huck changes, and Jim changes. And Twain himself changed on that river. And he definitely believes in the ability of a human being to become better, to become more than they were, more than what they were born to be. And that's a very American story and a very hopeful one in the end. So I hope you enjoy Twain and Bret Harte, and I will talk to you again in a couple of days. Sorry, I'm figuring out how to shut this down.